somewhere over central Germany, late 1944. A formation of American heavy bombers holds altitude at 25,000 feet. The crews scan the horizon for fighters, and then something appears. A silver shape, wing lines swept, moving impossibly fast. It slashes through the formation at over 500 miles per hour, cannons flashing. Before the tail gunners can track it, it is gone. No propeller, no engine roar they recognize. Just a high, thin shriek and a trail of exhaust. Escort fighters push throttles forward. They cannot close the gap. The shape vanishes eastward into haze. German radio boasts of a new weapon that will turn the tide. And then, weeks later, on a quiet airfield in southern Bavaria, American soldiers walk up to one of those machines, sitting silent on a cracked runway, its tires flat, its tanks dry. It is smaller than they imagined. What happens when the enemy's miracle machine lands in your hands? The aircraft was called the Messerschmitt Me 262. The Germans gave its fighter variant the name Schwalbe, meaning swallow. Its bomber variant was called Sturmvogel, the storm bird. Neither name captured what it truly was. It was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, and its appearance in the skies over Europe in the final year of the war introduced a problem the Allies had not fully anticipated: speed without precedent. The Me 262 could reach approximately 540 miles per hour. The best American escort fighter in the European theater, the North American P-51D Mustang, topped out around 437. That gap, roughly 120 miles per hour at comparable altitude, was not a marginal edge. It was an erasure of the rules that governed aerial combat since the first biplanes circled above the Somme. Every doctrine the Americans had built around formation flying, escort coordination, and gun convergence depended on a shared envelope of performance. The Me 262 broke that envelope, could accelerate past any Allied fighter operational in the European theater by approximately 150 kilometers per hour. In practical terms, that meant a P-51 pilot in a full-power pursuit could watch the jet pull away and disappear. There was no overtaking it. The jet dictated the terms of every engagement it chose. The aircraft was powered by two Junkers UMO 004B turbojet engines, underslung beneath swept wings that gave the airframe a look decades ahead of its contemporaries. Its armament was devastating. Four 30mm Mk108 cannons packed into the nose. A single well-placed burst from those cannons could sever the wing of a B-17 or blow an engine nacelle apart. Against tight bomber formations, the destructive potential was hideous. The jets would come in fast from astern, often in pairs or threes, close to 600 yards, fire in a brief hammering burst, and break away before defensive gunners could adjust. The speed differential meant the closing window lasted seconds. Tail gunners barely had time to rotate their turrets before the attacker was past and climbing. For American bomber crews already hardened by years of brutal losses over Germany, the appearance of the Me 262 introduced a new and specific kind of dread. Previous Luftwaffe interceptors, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, were dangerous, experienced and skilled, but they operated within the same physics as the escorts. A P-51 could turn with a 109. A P-47 could dive after a 190. The jet was different. It operated in a separate lane entirely, and the escorts were often powerless to intervene during a slashing high-speed pass. The jet would come, fire, and leave. The escort fighters would arrive at the point of interception too late. During the fall and winter of 1944, Encounters between Allied aircraft and the Me-262 slowly escalated. In September, USAAF General Karl Spaatz expressed a fear that if greater numbers of German jets appeared, they could inflict losses severe enough to force cancellation of the daylight bombing offensive. That was not the language of a man dismissing a minor threat. That was a warning rooted in mathematics. If the jets could not be countered, and if they appeared in sufficient numbers, the arithmetic of acceptable bomber losses would shift against the Allies. It did not happen that way, of course. Not even close. But the fear was real, and it lingered in every bomber formation that flew east into the winter haze, watching for the faintest streak of silver that moved unlike anything they had ever trained against. The Me-262 was not just a faster airplane, it was a faster future. And the men riding in the bomber streams over Berlin, over Leipzig, over Munich, felt its presence not in what it destroyed, but in what it promised. If the Germans could produce enough of them, if they could fuel them, if they could train the pilots. If. The word hung over every briefing room from England to eastern France like a held breath. The bomber crews did not know the WWII details yet. Not the metallurgy, not the fuel logistics, not the production bottlenecks. They only knew what they could see. Something impossibly fast, armed with cannons that shattered aircraft in seconds, operating beyond the reach of their protectors. That was enough. Subscribe if you want more hidden World War II histories told carefully. The German propaganda apparatus understood what it had. Not simply a weapon, but a narrative. The Messerschmitt Me 262 arrived at exactly the moment the Third Reich needed something to hold against the crushing weight of reality. And Joseph Goebbels' ministry knew how to shape that moment into a message. The jet was not presented to the German public merely as a new type of fighter plane. It was framed as evidence that German engineering remained supreme, evidence that the war's trajectory could still be bent, evidence that the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon concept that had become central to Nazi propaganda, was not fantasy but steel, thrust, and speed. The notion of the Wunderwaffe had roots stretching back well before the Me-262 reached operational status. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as Allied bombing intensified and the Eastern Front collapsed, German propaganda increasingly leaned on the promise of advanced technologies that would reverse the military situation. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, the Type 21 submarine, and the jet fighter. These weapons were presented not as individual programs, but as a collective proof of inevitable German triumph, the idea that science and will would override numbers and resources. For the Me-262 specifically, the propaganda took on a tone of certainty that bordered on mysticism. The jet was faster than any enemy aircraft. It could not be caught. It could not be intercepted. It would sweep the bomber formations from the sky and restore control of German airspace. Radio broadcasts repeated these themes. Newsreels showed the sleek, swept-wing silhouette in carefully composed footage. The message was aimed inward, at a civilian population enduring nightly bombardment, and outward, at Allied forces the regime hoped to intimidate. Adolf Hitler himself had fixated on the Me-262, though his relationship with the aircraft was famously conflicted. In mid-1943, during demonstrations of the prototype, Hitler saw its potential not as a defensive interceptor, but as an offensive fast bomber. He envisioned it streaking across the English Channel at the moment of the Allied invasion, dropping bombs on landing beaches with impunity. He ordered the aircraft configured as the Sturmvogel fighter-bomber variant insisting it carry bombs rather than prioritize its air-to-air capability. Engineers were compelled to modify the airframe. The decision caused friction at every level of the Luftwaffe's command structure, and the consequences were significant. Months of development effort were redirected. The fighter variant that experienced pilots like Adolf Galland wanted in their hands was delayed, though the full extent of that delay remains debated by historians. What is less debated is the effect of Hitler's belief that technology could substitute for strategic position. By late 1944, Germany had lost air superiority, was being systematically bombed by day and night, had lost France, was being pushed back on the Eastern Front, and was hemorrhaging fuel, materials, and trained personnel at a rate no weapon could compensate for. The Me 262 was real. Its speed was real. Its cannons were real. But the idea that a single aircraft type, no matter how advanced, could reverse the combined effects of strategic collapse was not engineering. It was faith. And the propaganda ministry sold that faith relentlessly. The German people, by this point in the war, existed in a strange landscape of desperation and hope. They could hear the bombers overhead. They could see the rubble. They could count the dead. And they were told, again and again, that relief was coming, that the new weapons would change everything. The Me 262 was the most visible embodiment of that promise. It was photographed, filmed, and narrated into a symbol far larger than any single weapons program could sustain. The Wunderwaffe narrative demanded miracles, and the Me 262 was forced to carry that weight. What the propaganda did not mention, and could not afford to mention, was the cascade of problems behind the airframe. Engine reliability, fuel shortages, pilot shortages, manufacturing disruptions caused by the very bombers the jet was supposed to stop. These truths were classified not merely as military secrets, but as existential threats to morale. If the public learned that the wonder weapon could barely stay airborne long enough to matter, the narrative would collapse. So the truth was buried under spectacle. Newsreel footage of jets taking off into dramatic clouds, radio announcements of enemy bombers destroyed, statistics curated for maximum impact and minimum context. The myth was not a lie in the simplest sense. The Me 262 was real, and it was extraordinary. But the packaging around it, the promise that it represented salvation, that was something else entirely. And it would take the end of the war, the physical capture of the machines, and the cold scrutiny of American engineers to separate the aircraft from the story that had been built around it. For now, in the winter of 1944, the myth was holding. Barely, but holding. The Americans had not been idle. Long before the first Me 262 was spotted slashing through a bomber formation, Allied intelligence was assembling a picture of what the Germans were building. It began with fragments, pieces of information gathered from resistance networks, intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance. The picture was incomplete, as intelligence pictures always are, but by 1943 it had edges sharp enough to cause concern. Reports reaching the United States and Britain described a German aircraft powered by a new type of engine, faster than anything in production on either side. The descriptions were vague at first. Some mentioned a turbine-driven power plant. Others spoke of an aircraft with no visible propeller. A few contained rough estimates of speed that seemed exaggerated until they were corroborated by multiple independent sources. The Office of Strategic Services forwarded reports. British intelligence shared intercepts. Reconnaissance missions over Messerschmitt facilities at Augsburg and the neighboring test airfield at Lechfeld returned images of unusual airframes that did not match any known German type. The swept wings, the underslung engine nacelles, the tricycle landing gear. By 1944, as the jet engine itself became an understood concept among Allied engineers, the intelligence shifted from wondering whether the Germans had jets to asking how many and how soon. Intelligence experts at Wright Field in Ohio began compiling lists of advanced German aviation equipment they wanted to examine. These lists would later become formalized as the blacklists, detailed manifests of specific enemy aircraft, engines, weapons, and research documents prioritized for capture. The Me 262 sat near the top. The first confirmed combat encounters in the summer and fall of 1944 transformed the Me 262 from an intelligence curiosity into an operational concern. Returning bomber crews filed reports describing the attacks, fast approach from the rear, cannons that hit hard enough to tear structural members apart, an inability to pursue or engage. Fighter escort pilots filed their own reports, most of which carried the same frustrated conclusion. They could not catch it. The strategic implications were addressed at the highest levels. General Spatz's warning about the potential cancellation of the daylight bombing offensive if jet numbers grew was not made lightly. The entire American air campaign over Europe depended on the ability to sustain acceptable loss rates. If the jets could push those rates above the threshold, the campaign would become unsustainable. The math was straightforward, and the jet threatened to change it. American tactical responses emerged. P-51 Mustang pilots developed techniques to attack Me 262s at their most vulnerable moments, during takeoff and landing, when the jet's engines were still spooling up and its speed advantage had not yet materialized. Fighter sweeps began targeting known Me-262 airfields, attempting to catch the jets on the ground or in the slow, fuel-heavy minutes before they reached operational speed. These tactics worked, not because the Mustang could match the Me-262 in the air, but because every machine has a moment of weakness, and the jet's moment came at the threshold of the runway. But tactics were one response. There was another, quieter and more deliberate. Somewhere in the halls of Wright Field, in the planning rooms of the Army Air Force's Intelligence Service, a different kind of operation was taking shape. If the war ended with Germany's collapse, and the trajectory by late 1944 made that outcome increasingly likely, there would be a window. German airfields would be overrun. Factories would fall. And somewhere in the wreckage there might be intact examples of the most advanced aircraft in the world. The blacklists were not theoretical documents. They were shopping lists, and the item circled at the top, in every variation and variant, was the Messerschmitt Me 262. The decision was clear, even if the opportunity had not yet arrived. If an intact jet was found, it had to be seized, studied, and understood. Not in a year. Not after the bureaucracies sorted themselves out. Immediately. That decision would require a specific kind of team. Pilots willing to fly enemy aircraft with unknown characteristics. Engineers who could evaluate and repair machines they had never seen. Maintenance crews who could work without manuals, without parts inventories, without certainty. And all of it would have to happen in the chaos of a collapsing nation, on airfields still littered with the debris of war. The planning was underway. The people were being selected. The lists were being refined. All that remained was the collapse itself. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was disintegrating. The collapse was not clean. It was not orderly. It was a convulsion that moved across the map from east and west simultaneously. a closing vise of armored columns, infantry divisions, air power, and logistics chains that ground through German resistance with the weight of industrial nations behind them. The Soviets pushed from the east. The Americans, British, and French pushed from the west. And between them, the remaining structure of the German war machine broke apart in pieces. For the Luftwaffe, the collapse was both physical and functional. Fuel supplies, already devastated by the Allied strategic bombing campaign against the German oil industry, reached a critical nadir. Airfields were damaged or overrun faster than units could relocate. Aircraft that were mechanically intact sat unable to fly for lack of fuel, for lack of pilots, for lack of orders that made sense in a world where the chain of command was fracturing. Some units attempted to relocate southward, toward Bavaria and Austria, where terrain and distance from the front might buy days or weeks. Others simply stopped. The American advance into southern Germany during April 1945 moved with a momentum that outpaced the defenders' ability to organize. Armored spearheads drove down autobahns, through towns that offered token resistance or none at all, past columns of German soldiers walking westward with their hands raised. And as the ground forces advanced, following behind them, sometimes right alongside them, were the air technical intelligence teams. These were the men trained at Wright Field, the ones who had spent months studying photographs and intelligence reports, memorizing the shapes of aircraft they had never touched. They carried the black lists. They knew what they were looking for. And as the American line pushed past Augsburg, past the Messerschmitt factory complex, past the old Bavarian farmland that had become the industrial spine of Germany's jet program, they found it. Lechfeld Airfield sat south of Augsburg, in flat country along the Lech River. It had been one of the most important centers of Me 262 development and testing. The Messerschmitt works at Augsburg used Lechfeld as a test airfield throughout the war. American Army units moved into the area in early May 1945 and seized the airfield with little or no opposition. Most of the buildings had been destroyed by previous air attacks, but the aircraft were there. The scene that greeted the first American soldiers was neither triumph nor horror. It was something quieter. An airfield scarred by bomb craters, buildings reduced to shells and scattered across the field, in revetments, along taxiways, nosed into tree lines, a collection of Messerschmitt Me 262s in various states of condition. Some were damaged, some were partially disassembled, some appeared to be intact. About 25 relatively intact examples sat across the field, including at least one of the coveted two-seat trainer variants. Some had flat tires, some had panels open, as if maintenance had been abandoned mid-task. Some showed signs of deliberate sabotage, instruments smashed, wiring cut. Others appeared untouched, as if their pilots had simply walked away. The 54th Air Disarmament Squadron, among the first American units to take custody of the field, established security and began the initial assessment. They were not engineers. They were soldiers doing a soldier's job, securing captured equipment and keeping it from being looted or destroyed further. But their work was complicated by the sheer strangeness of the aircraft. Some of the GIs, encountering a jet aircraft for the first time, did not fully understand how fragile the machines could be. One incident reportedly involved a group of soldiers accidentally collapsing the nose gear of a 262 while attempting to tow it. Well-intentioned curiosity meeting unfamiliar engineering. Beyond Lechfeld, other airfields told similar stories. Across southern Germany and into Austria, American and British forces found Me 262s scattered like discarded tools. Some had been flown to fields and abandoned when the fuel ran out. Some had been surrendered by their pilots. One of the most significant early captures occurred at Rhine-Main, where a defecting German test pilot named Hans Fay surrendered a still unpainted Me 262 on March 31, 1945, handing the Allies the first intact, airworthy example of the jet. The airfield at Lechfeld, though, was the prize, not because of one aircraft, but because of the concentration. The machines were there, the Messerschmitt factory was in nearby Augsburg, and the men who had built, maintained, and flown these jets were, in many cases, still in the area. Some in hiding, some waiting to be captured, some simply standing by, uncertain of what came next. What came next was a team with a very specific mission and a very narrow window of time. On April 22, 1945, with the war in its final weeks, the United States Army Air Forces formally consolidated its technical intelligence and post-hostilities objectives under a single code name. The code name was Lusty, an acronym standing for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. The mission was direct: capture and evaluate German aeronautical technology before it could be destroyed, dispersed, or seized by competing Allied nations, particularly the Soviet Union. Operation Lusty had two teams. Team 1 was led by Colonel Harold E. Watson, a former Wright Field test pilot with the exact combination of skills the mission required. Watson's job was to find, secure, and collect enemy aircraft and weapons for examination in the United States. Team 2, led by Colonel Howard M. McCoy, focused on recruiting scientists, gathering technical documents, and investigating research facilities. Watson's team would become the more famous of the two, known eventually by a nickname that stuck through history: Watson's Whizzers. It was a name that sounds almost lighthearted, but the work it described was anything but. Watson assembled a group of pilots, engineers, and maintenance men. They were young, most of them. Experienced in the war, yes, but not in the machines they were about to handle. They carried the black lists, the detailed intelligence manifests identifying every high-priority piece of German aviation technology targeted for capture. The Me 262 sat at the top of that list, circled and underlined by the urgency of the jet age. When the Whizzers reached Lechfeld, they found what the advance units had already secured. The airfield, now redesignated Advanced Landing Ground R-71, held approximately 25 relatively intact Me 262s. Watson's team was ordered to resurrect 15 of them to flyable condition. The task was enormous. Many of the aircraft were damaged, some from Allied bombing, some from hasty German attempts at dispersal, some from the casual handling of American troops unfamiliar with the type. The engineers began methodically. Each aircraft was inspected, every panel was opened. The teams looked for traps and sabotage, a precaution rooted in hard experience. Retreating German forces sometimes booby-trapped equipment, and an aircraft packed with explosives disguised as a maintenance panel could kill an entire inspection crew. The Whizzers found no such traps at Lechfeld. What they found instead was damage and neglect, the evidence of a war machine that had been running on fumes. Watson needed expertise the Whizzers did not yet have. The Me 262 was unlike any aircraft his pilots had flown. Its engines operated on different principles. Its cockpit ergonomics, throttle response, and takeoff characteristics were foreign. So Watson did something pragmatic and, in the context of the immediate post-war moment, remarkably efficient. He recruited German personnel. Karl Bauer, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot of experimental aircraft, was captured with the fall of the Augsburg factory on April 29th. He was quickly put to work, not merely as an instructor pilot, but in direct support of the mechanics rebuilding the 262s. Ludwig Hofmann, another Messerschmitt test pilot whom the Americans nicknamed Willie, joined the effort. An engineering superintendent named Gerhard Kohlis contributed technical knowledge of the aircraft systems. Another Luftwaffe pilot, Hauptmann Heinz Brauer, was approached by one of Watson's men on May 8th, the day Germany surrendered. Brauer had just flown 70 women, children, and wounded troops to Munich-Riem Airport. He was given a choice: a prison camp or flying with the Whizzers. He chose flying. The work at Lechfeld proceeded under conditions that blended urgency with improvisation. Engines were pulled from unflyable airframes and installed in more promising ones. Parts were cannibalized. The Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg, battered but not obliterated, provided some support. The German test pilots served as living manuals, walking the American mechanics through procedures that no written technical order in the U.S. inventory could provide. The jets were inspected, evaluated, repaired, tested, and prepared. The ones selected for flight were given names by their American handlers. Mechanics from the 54th Air Disarmament Squadron christened individual airframes with names from home. One became Vera, named after the sister-in-law of Staff Sergeant Eugene Freiberger. Others received different names as they changed hands. The naming was informal, personal, and fleeting. It was also human, the instinct to make something strange and foreign into something familiar. Watson's mission was not to keep the aircraft at Lechfeld. They were headed for the United States. But first, they had to be flown out, from Lechfeld to collection points in France, and from France to the port of Cherbourg, where they would be loaded onto a ship for the transatlantic crossing. That meant the aircraft had to fly, and that meant American pilots had to learn to fly them. The German test pilots would be their teachers, but the flights themselves would be made by Americans. Young men who had spent the war in Thunderbolts and Mustangs, piston engine fighters that obeyed different laws, were about to climb into the cockpits of jet-powered aircraft for the first time. What waited for them was revelation, wrapped in fragility. The first thing the American pilots learned about the Me 262 was that it did not behave like anything they had flown before. The second thing they learned was that its temperament demanded a kind of patience that combat flying in Thunderbolts and Mustangs had never required. The aircraft was not forgiving. It was not intuitive. It was, in the careful assessment of those who flew it after the war, a machine that rewarded precision and punished haste. The Whizzers did not have a surplus of flyable two-seat trainers, so most of the instruction happened on the ground. A non-flyable Me 262 at Lechfeld was tied down and used as a static training tool, engines running, controls live, the aircraft going nowhere. The German test pilots walked the Americans through startup procedures, throttle management, and the critical idiosyncrasies of the Jumo 004 engines. The instruction was intensive and compressed. There was no 6-month training syllabus. There were days. And then the Americans would fly. The engine was the core of every lesson. The Junkers Jumo 004B was the world's first turbojet engine in mass production, and it embodied both the triumph and the limits of German wartime engineering. It was temperamental. Throttle movements had to be made slowly and smoothly. The aircraft was reportedly delightful to fly, as long as the pilot used care in moving the throttles to avoid an engine compressor stall. Those compressor stalls were not minor inconveniences. At altitude, a flameout could leave a pilot gliding in a heavy, draggy airframe with no power, scrambling to restart in a narrow window of altitude and airspeed. Below 13,000 feet, a restart was possible. Above it, the engine became increasingly temperamental, and the odds of recovery dropped. The American pilots absorbed this. They were not inexperienced men. Many had hundreds of combat hours. But the transition from piston to jet was not just a step up in speed. It was a conceptual shift. In a Mustang, throttle response was immediate. Push forward, and power arrived. In the 262, there was lag. The turbines had to spool. Abrupt throttle changes could choke the airflow and kill the engine entirely. The pilots had to retrain their hands, their reflexes, the deep muscle memory that had kept them alive over Normandy and the Rhine. On June 10, 1945, the first formation of repaired Me 262s departed Lechfeld for France. Watson's team flew them to Melun-Villaroche airfield, southeast of Paris, with an intermediate stop at Saint-Dizier. For 5 of the American pilots, it was their first time soloing in a jet aircraft. Their performance was flawless, a fact that reflected both the quality of the abbreviated instruction and the skill of men who had spent years flying under pressure. At Melun, the Whizzers waited. General Karl Spaatz, the commander of U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe, wanted to see the captured jets demonstrated. For more than 2 weeks, the team busied themselves with additional preparations, collecting other captured German aircraft, checking out new pilots, and applying the names and markings that history would remember them by. The demonstration for Spaatz took place on June 27, 1945. 3 jets took off. One developed a landing gear problem and had to return immediately. The other 2 executed high-speed passes for the general, and one pilot took the opportunity to perform something none of them had yet attempted in the type: aerobatics. The jet handled it. But the demonstrations, as impressive as they were not the point. The point was what the pilots had felt in the cockpit. The speed was undeniable. The acceleration, once the engines were spooled, was unlike anything in piston-driven experience. The view through the canopy at 500 miles an hour was a kind of clarity that belonged to a different era of aviation. These were men raised on Pratt and Whitney radials and Packard Merlins. The whine of the Jumo 004, the smooth surge of thrust, without vibration, the sensation of being pushed rather than pulled, it was foreign. It was the future arriving in their hands. And yet, every flight confirmed something else. The engines were fragile. The power that made the jet extraordinary was delivered by machinery that operated at the edge of its own tolerance. Careful throttle handling was not a suggestion. It was the margin between flight and disaster. One of the captured Me 262s sent to the U.S. Navy for testing at Patuxent River would later have its test flights canceled entirely after the pilot was forced to make 3 successive emergency landings due to engine flameouts. That was not an aircraft in full command of its performance. That was an aircraft performing despite itself. The myth of the invincible jet was not shattered in a single moment at Lechfeld or Melun. It eroded, flight by flight, throttle movement by throttle movement, in the hands of men who could feel the gap between what the aircraft promised and what it reliably delivered. The Me 262 was fast. It was powerful. It was beautiful in its way. It was also, they were beginning to understand, compromised at its core. After the flights, the real work began. The demonstrations and the ferry flights had been necessary. They had moved the aircraft toward their final destination and confirmed the jet's performance envelope in American hands. But the deeper mission of Operation Lusty was never about flying. It was about understanding, and understanding required disassembly. When the captured Me-262s reached the United States, ferried from Cherbourg to Newark aboard the British escort carrier HMS Reaper, arriving July 31, 1945, they were transported to Wright Field and Freeman Field in Indiana. There, the Army Air Force's technical intelligence teams did what they had been trained to do. They opened the panels. They pulled the engines. They took the aircraft apart, piece by piece, system by system, and examined what they found with the detached precision of engineers confronting a solved equation. The Junkers Jumo 004B engines were the primary focus. These were the power plants that had terrified bomber, cruise, and frustrated escort pilots. They were the engines that the propaganda ministry had presented as embodiments of German technological supremacy. In the quiet, well-lit inspection bays at Wright Field, they became objects of measurement, not mystique. The first thing the American engineers noted was the metallurgy. The initial 004A prototype engines had been built without restrictions on materials, using scarce raw materials such as nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum in quantities acceptable for testing but impossible for mass production. Germany's strategic material situation had made this untenable. The production version, the 004B, had been fundamentally redesigned to minimize the use of these critical metals. All high-heat metal parts, including the combustion chamber, were changed to mild steel, protected only against oxidation by an aluminum coating. The hollow turbine blades were produced from folded and welded chromodur alloy, a composition of 12% chromium, 18% manganese, and 70% iron, developed by Krupp. These blades were cooled by compressed air bled from the compressor. The substitution of materials had consequences. The production engine weighed less than the prototype, but its operational lifespan was dramatically shortened. The expected lifespan from the factory for the production Jumo 004B was approximately 25 hours. In field conditions, the real-world figure was often far less, with reports ranging from 8 to 12 hours before an overhaul or replacement was needed. Some early engines failed after a single flight. Combustion chamber buckling and turbine blade creep were the primary failure modes, both consequences of running hot metal parts made from inadequate alloys at temperatures they were never designed to sustain long-term. The American engineers measured it all. They documented the construction techniques. They noted the folded turbine blades, the aluminum spray coatings, the cast magnesium casings, the clever but desperate solutions to the material shortages that shaped every component. They found a starter system that consisted of a small Wright two-stroke motorcycle engine hidden inside the intake, a pioneering auxiliary power unit that spun the turbine to starting speed. They found fuel systems designed to run on synthetic kerosene produced from coal, a fuel the Germans could manufacture domestically when their petroleum sources were cut off. They found production shortcuts that spoke of an industry under siege, parts that fit imperfectly, tolerances that varied from engine to engine, evidence of forced labor and haste in manufacture. The picture that emerged was not of a mature weapons system. It was of a revolutionary concept executed under impossible conditions. The aerodynamics were advanced. The swept-wing design, the underslung nacelle configuration, the nose-mounted armament, these features were genuinely forward-looking and would influence jet fighter design for decades. But the engine, the heart of the machine's advantage, was operating beyond its own material limits. It was a first-generation power plant forced into combat before the metallurgical science existed to make it reliable. The Germans had found ways to make it work, barely, temporarily. at costs measured in hours of service life, rather than the thousands of hours that would later become standard for jet engines. The American evaluation teams did not treat the JUMO 004 with contempt. They treated it with scientific thoroughness. Every measurement was recorded. Every alloy was analyzed. Every failure mode was catalogued. The engine was not a joke. It was the first of its kind in production, and the engineering required to make it function at all, under wartime material constraints, represented genuine innovation. But innovation and reliability are not the same thing. The JUMO 004 was innovative. It was not reliable. And in the clinical light of the Wright Field inspection bays, that distinction was quantified, documented, and filed. The contradiction at the core of the Me 262 was that its greatest strengths existed in direct tension with its most crippling flaws. The Americans, having now flown the aircraft and disassembled its engines, could see both sides of the equation clearly. The jet was extraordinary. The jet was also, in several critical respects, inadequate. The speed was real. At approximately 540 miles per hour, the Me 262 outpaced the P-51 Mustang by roughly 120 miles per hour. Against heavy bombers flying at perhaps 200 miles per hour in formation, the closing speed was enormous. The four 30mm Mk-108 cannons were devastating against airframes designed to withstand .50 caliber machine gun fire, not explosive cannon shells. In its element, in a high-speed slashing attack against a bomber stream, the Me 262 was a weapon of terrible efficiency. The swept-wing design, born partly from aerodynamic research and partly from the practical need to position the center of gravity correctly relative to the heavy engine nacelles, gave the aircraft handling characteristics that were, by the standards of 1944, remarkably clean at high speed. Pilots who flew it reported light, effective controls at speed, well harmonized and responsive. The airframe introduced features that would become standard in post-war jet design, including the swept wing itself, wing leading edge slats for low-speed handling, and the underslung engine nacelle configuration. The Me 262 was, in a genuine sense, the template for the jet fighter as a concept. And yet, the engine lifespan of 25 hours under ideal conditions, and often far less under field conditions, meant the Luftwaffe faced a maintenance burden that was unsustainable at scale. Landing gear and engine failures together accounted for approximately 60 to 70% of all non-combat losses. The aircraft required well-maintained runways, which the Allies were systematically destroying. In the last weeks of the war, some Me 262 units were forced to operate from stretches of the Autobahn, which provided straight, paved surfaces but lacked every other facility an airfield needs. Fuel was a parallel crisis. The Allied campaign against German synthetic fuel production had been devastatingly effective. Jet fuel, while somewhat easier to produce than high-octane aviation gasoline, was not immune to the broader collapse of the fuel supply chain. Me 262s were sometimes towed to the end of the runway by horses to conserve fuel for the flight itself. That image, a jet aircraft being pulled to takeoff position by draft animals, captured the absurdity of the technological gap between the machine and the infrastructure that was supposed to support it. Pilot shortages compounded everything. Training new pilots to fly the Me 262 safely required time, fuel, and instructors, all of which were in desperately short supply. The two-seat trainer variant of the 262 was produced in very small numbers. Many pilots made their first jet flight in a single-seat aircraft without an instructor. The results were predictable. Accidents were frequent, Experienced pilots could adapt. Inexperienced ones, rushed through abbreviated training programs, could not. Although approximately 1,443 Me-262s were completed during the war, the number that actually saw combat was far smaller. Estimates suggest that only about 300 ever flew operational missions. The rest were destroyed in training accidents, by Allied bombing on the ground, or simply sat idle for lack of fuel, engines, or pilots. The gap between production numbers and operational impact tells the full story. The Me-262 could not appear in decisive numbers because the system that built it, fueled it, and manned it was collapsing. The largest jet operation of the war illustrated both the potential and the limitation. On March 18, 1945, 37 Me-262s of Jagdgeschwader 7 intercepted a force of 1,221 American bombers, escorted by 632 fighters. They shot down 12 bombers and 1 fighter for the loss of 3 Me-262s. The kill ratio was extraordinary, but the absolute impact was negligible. 12 bombers out of over 1,200 represented roughly 1% of the attacking force. The Allies could absorb that loss without hesitation. The mathematics of attrition were simply not on the jet's side, no matter how impressive its individual performance. That was the truth the American evaluation teams could now see in full. The Me-262 was not a failed aircraft. It was an aircraft that arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong quantities, supported by the wrong infrastructure, in a country that no longer had the capacity to exploit its potential. The design was sound. The concept was prophetic. The execution was crippled by material science, logistics, leadership decisions, and the irreversible momentum of a war already lost. Getting the captured aircraft out of Europe and into the hands of American engineers was its own operation, as methodical as the combat that preceded it. The war was over, but the work was accelerating. Across the occupation zones, other nations were conducting their own searches. The Soviets, the British, and the French were all collecting German aviation technology with equal urgency. The Americans knew that what they did not secure quickly would disappear into other programs, other laboratories, other nations' jet development timelines. Watson's Whizzers flew the serviceable Me-262s from Lechfeld through France in stages. The first leg went to Saint-Dizier, then to Melun, and finally to Cherbourg, the collection point for all captured German aircraft destined for the United States. Not a single one of the 9 flyable Me-262s ferried by the Whizzers was lost in transit. The logistics were tight, the flying was careful, and the results were, given the circumstances, remarkable. At Cherbourg, the aircraft were cocooned against salt air and weather, then loaded onto HMS Reaper, a British escort carrier that had been made available for the transatlantic crossing. Alongside the Me-262s, the carrier held an assortment of other captured German aircraft, an aerial museum of the Luftwaffe's final generation technology. They departed France on July 19, 1945, and arrived in Newark, New Jersey on July 31st. The aircraft were offloaded and transported by barge to Newark Army Airfield, where they were prepared for the final leg to Wright Field and Freeman Field. The total haul of Operation Lusty was staggering. Watson's team had captured over 16,000 items, totaling approximately 6,200 tons. Of those, 2,398 separate items were selected for detailed technical analysis. The scope went far beyond individual aircraft. It included instruments, weapons systems, radar equipment, documents, blueprints, and research materials that collectively represented the sum of German aeronautical achievement during the war. At Wright Field, the Me-262S entered the evaluation pipeline. American and Navy engineers at both Wright-Patterson and the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland, subjected the jets to systematic flight testing and technical analysis. Every flight expanded the dataset. Every disassembly confirmed or revised what had been hypothesized from intelligence alone. The influence of what they found spread outward through the American aviation industry in ways both direct and diffuse. The swept-wing concept, validated by the Me-262's performance, accelerated research that was already underway in the United States. The data on axial flow turbojet design informed the development of American engines. The solutions the Germans had found for high-speed aerodynamic challenges, wing slots, leading-edge slats, tricycle landing gear configuration, all of it entered the intellectual bloodstream of post-war American aircraft design. One specific and illustrative thread runs from the Me-262 to the North American F-86 Sabre, the American jet fighter that would dominate the skies of the Korean War just 5 years later. An engineer on the F-86 design team studied German language in night school specifically to read captured Me-262 manuals and technical documents. The swept-wing configuration of the F-86, often cited as one of the critical design decisions that gave it superiority over the Soviet MiG-15, drew directly from German research captured as part of Operation Lusty and its parallel intelligence efforts. The technology was absorbed, studied, improved, and in many cases surpassed within a few years. The Jumo 004's limitations, its short service life, its material compromises, its sensitivity to throttle handling, were all problems that American and British engineers attacked with access to strategic materials, better metallurgy, and the luxury of peacetime development timelines that the Germans had never enjoyed. The Me-262 did not transform American aviation by providing a template to copy. It transformed American aviation by providing a benchmark to exceed. Its strengths showed what was possible. Its flaws showed what remained to be solved. And the combination of both, captured in a few frantic weeks of operational intelligence, compressed years of independent research into months. The machines that had terrified the bomber streams over Germany were now test articles in Ohio and Maryland, stripped of their mythology, measured in units of thrust, fatigue life, and structural tolerance. From fear to data. That was the trajectory, and the data would prove far more valuable than the fear had ever been. The question endured long after the last Me-262 was crated and shipped, long after the engineers filed their reports and the test pilots moved on to newer aircraft. Could the Me-262 have changed the war? It is the kind of question that invites counterfactual speculation, the historian's temptation to reconstruct a world that did not happen. And the Me-262 attracts this speculation more than almost any other weapon of the Second World War, because the gap between what it could do and what it actually achieved is so large, so tantalizing, that it seems to demand an explanation rooted in missed opportunities rather than inherent limitations. The most common version of the argument centers on timing and Hitler's interference. If the Me-262 had been deployed as a pure fighter interceptor 6 months or a year earlier, if Hitler had not insisted on the bomber variant, if production had not been disrupted by Allied bombing, if fuel had been available, if trained pilots had been plentiful, if the engines had been more reliable. The chain of ifs extends in every direction, each one representing a node where history might have pivoted. But the accumulation of those ifs is itself the answer. The Me-262's failure to change the war was not the result of one decision or one bottleneck. It was the result of all of them simultaneously. The engine development proved lengthy and difficult. The metallurgy for the turbine blades was never adequately solved during the war. The fuel crisis was systemic and worsening. The pilot training pipeline had been gutted by years of attrition. The factory system was under constant bombardment. And the strategic situation, the simple mathematical reality that Germany was fighting the combined industrial output of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire, meant that no single weapon system, regardless of its performance, could reverse the equation. Consider the production numbers. Approximately 1,443 Me-262s were completed. Of those, only about 300 saw combat. At no point during the war were more than about 200 operational at the same time. Against an Allied air force that could field thousands of bombers and thousands of escorts on a single operation, 200 jets, even jets of extraordinary capability, were a statistical footnote. The March 18, 1945, intercept by JG-7 proved it, a 4-to-1 kill ratio. And yet the total impact on the attacking force was 1%. The engine lifespan sealed the calculus. Even if Germany had produced more airframes, each one needed engines that lasted, under ideal conditions, 25 hours. In real-world field conditions, often far less. The maintenance burden per sortie was enormous. The logistics chain to supply replacement engines was fractured. The infrastructure to support jet operations, long, well-maintained runways, fuel depots, trained mechanics, was being systematically destroyed by the very air campaign the jets were supposed to defeat. And then, there was the human cost that shadowed the entire program. The fuselages of the Me-262 were produced in underground factories, including the vast tunnel complex beneath St. Georgen an der Gusen in Austria, where slave laborers from the Gusen II concentration camp worked under conditions of extreme brutality. An estimated 35,000 to 50,000 people died in the forced labor that built the Me-262. The typical life expectancy in Gusen II was 6 months. The wonder weapon was built on a foundation of human suffering that no technical assessment can separate from the machine itself. The legend of the Me-262 persists because it occupies a specific niche in the imagination, the advanced weapon that arrived just too late. The technological masterpiece undone by circumstance rather than design. It is a comforting narrative for those who admire engineering excellence, because it locates the failure outside the machine. But the reality was more layered. The failure was also inside the machine, inside the turbine blades that could not hold their shape, inside the combustion chambers that buckled, inside the engines that could not be built with adequate materials because the nation that designed them had already exhausted its strategic reserves, fighting a war on 2 fronts. The Me-262 was not a war-winning weapon denied by bad luck. It was a brilliant concept struggling against the limits of its own time, its own materials, its own nation's collapsing capacity to build, fuel, and fly it. The myth says it could have changed everything. The data says it could not. Return, for a moment, to the sky over central Germany. Late 1944. A bomber formation at altitude, engines droning, crews scanning the horizon through fogged plexiglass. The cold at 25,000 feet is a living thing, pressing through every seam of leather and fleece. The men are tired. They are always tired. And then someone calls it out. A shape low on the horizon moving fast. Moving impossibly fast. Silver, swept wings, no propeller. It rises toward the formation, at a rate that makes the escorts look stationary. The tail gunners swing their turrets. The waist gunners brace, and the shape punches through the formation, cannons firing, and is gone before the tracers can find it. The bomber stream shudders. One aircraft trails fire, another loses an engine. The escorts push their throttles forward, but the shape is already a dot, shrinking eastward at a speed they cannot touch. That was the fear. That was the moment that defined the Me 262 in the minds of the men who faced it. And it was real. The speed was real. The firepower was real. The dread was real. Now move forward, a few months. A workshop in Ohio. A captured Jumo 004B engine sits on a test stand, panels removed, turbine blades exposed under fluorescent light. An American engineer in shirt sleeves holds a micrometer to a blade. He measures its composition. He notes the folded chromadur alloy, the absence of nickel, the aluminum spray coating already beginning to degrade. He records the combustion chamber deformation, the creep patterns in the turbine section, the slight warping that accumulates with each hour of operation. He calculates a service life that is measured not in years, not in months, but in hours. Dozens of hours. Then failure. He does not feel fear. He feels curiosity. He feels the specific intellectual satisfaction of understanding a problem, quantifying it, and seeing the path to solving it. The war in the air over Europe was not decided by speed alone. It was not decided by any single aircraft, any single weapon, any single act of technological brilliance. It was decided by the intersection of industry, logistics, resources, training, leadership, and time. The Me 262 possessed one attribute in extraordinary measure, speed, and lacked nearly everything else required to translate that attribute into strategic effect. It arrived too late. It arrived too fragile. It arrived in too few numbers. And it arrived into a war that was already lost. The men who flew the bomber streams over Germany in 1944 did not know this. They knew only the fear. The men who captured the jets at Lechfeld in 1945 did not fully know it yet either. They knew only the prize. It was the men in the workshops, the ones with the micrometers and the alloy charts and the test stand data, who completed the picture. They took the machine that had haunted the skies and turned it into numbers on a page. Thrust output, turbine temperature, blade creep rate, service life, material composition, manufacturing tolerance. The myth of the Wunderwaffe did not die in a single dogfight. It did not die when the first Me 262 was shot down by ground fire, or when Mustangs learned to patrol the jet airfields, or when fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Those were wounds. The killing blow came later, in quiet rooms, with calibrated instruments, delivered not by warriors, but by engineers. The war in the air was decided the day America opened the panels and learned the truth.